Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the Center for British Art. I'm David Blight. I direct the Gilder Lehrman Center for the Study of Slavery and Abolition. We are co-sponsoring Jim Walvin's lecture with the British Art Center. We always love to work with this museum. We've done two major conferences here over the past several years, and we'll do anything in the future that you want to do. But I have a special little gift for Amy Myers, the director here. Some of you in this audience know, and probably have a drawer full of them, that every year at the Frederick Douglass Book Prize dinner or reception in New York, which is next Tuesday, we hand out buttons with Frederick Douglass's picture on it. But this year we have a new photo of Douglass. After all those years of a photo I got tired of, we have a new button, a new photo, a photo that has never been used in public until the recent collection of Douglass photographs. It's a Douglass of either 1857 or 58, and I have one more here for Amy. You have to wear it. At the Douglass dinner, we always hand these out, and I tell people to go back to their offices, wherever they work. It's a lot of corporate people sometimes, and I tell them, you got to walk into your office the next day and say, so who's this? You know, I don't think they do it, but anyway, it's a great pleasure to introduce a dear friend of mine. He's a little worried about this introduction. Don't worry, Jim. I wouldn't do this to you. Jim Walvin, James Walvin, is Professor Emeritus of History at York University in England, where he has taught for many decades. Jim has held visiting positions around the world, in the Caribbean, in Australia, and here in the U.S., and particularly here, we're proud to say he did a full semester fellowship at the GLC with us. He did a fellowship here at the British Art Center. He did a lot of the research for this book he's about to talk about right here in New Haven. And the pub date for this book, believe it or not, is today, January 24th. Only one copy has appeared, and Jim just got it last night. Here it is. We're sorry we don't have copies for sale out, but they'll be there soon, and Amazon already has it up so you can order it. Sorry to the bookstore for saying that. You can't possibly mention all the books Jim Walvin has written. I won't, only I'll mention just a few. But I want to say a couple things about him. One of the best books he's ever written, I hope, but it's a good thing Jim did. Jim grew up in Manchester, the Manchester of the cotton boom, the Manchester of the mills, the Manchester of the origin of industrialization, the Manchester of the origin of the English working class, et cetera, et cetera. And this lovely and sometimes harrowing little memoir called Different Times, which is really just about his childhood and, well, up to when he goes to university. Growing up in post-war England, you really learn a lot about Jim Walvin, and I urge you to get a copy. It's about working class values. It's about working class life. It's about the air in Manchester, without ever beating you over the head and saying, I'm from the working class. But it's especially about how he became interested in history. Particularly sitting at the feet and listening to the stories of two of his uncles, one who had been a veteran of World War I and one who was a veteran of World War II. It was their stories, as Jim relates it in this book, in his usual terse, beautiful prose with no words wasted. That's how Jim became, in a sense, an enthusiast for history, and later then a historian. Jim is one of the pioneers of not just of slavery and the slave trade in the Atlantic world, but of black history generally. And I'll never forget the time that my colleagues Hazel Carby, who's here, and Cass Phillips, who couldn't be here tonight, came to me, this was, 5 years ago at least, and said, let's do a conference in honor of Jim, he's retiring. And I said, great idea, let's do that. And we did. And both of them told their own stories, which they can tell better, about how they got interested in this story, in part by reading Walvin, before they'd ever had a chance to meet him, when they were literally coming of age in Britain. Jim played a major role, in fact was the key historian in the 2007 British commemoration of the end of the slave trade, an event many of us remember. There were exhibitions all over Britain about that, one of which was in Parliament, in the House of Commons, I believe. And Jim was the curator of that exhibition. It's a marvel. If you get to know Jim and talk to him about it, it's a marvelous story of how he got on that committee and how they pulled off that commemoration all over Britain. Now, to mention a few of his books, it's hard to decide which ones. He's written over 40 books, at least by my count, and I'm probably low. He's written Black Ivory. He's written The Trader, The Overseer, and the Slave. He's written books on the Black Atlantic, edited collections on the Black Atlantic. He wrote a marvelous book by Yale Press called The Zong, which is the story of that infamous, hideous slave ship, the Zong, where the slaves were thrown overboard and so on and so forth for the insurance money, and which led to the Somerset case in England, et cetera, et cetera. Jim has reached broad audiences with his work, perhaps more than anyone else working in this field. He's probably had more readers than anyone else in this field of the broad study of Atlantic slavery, the slave trade, and slavery in the Americas. His first book was a study of Jamaica with Michael Creighton, now quite a long time ago. The new book he's going to talk about tonight is called Slavery and Small Things, Slavery and Modern Cultural Habits. It's the wonderful, at times harrowing, which is what usually this story is, of the objects, the commodities, the things, not just that slavery produced, but the objects that became luxuries. I guess the Harwood is the ultimate luxury we're going to hear about. But in this book you read about everything from cowrie shells to mahogany to the great mansions, manor houses of Britain, to ironwork, to cotton cloth, which the working class of England learned to not just wear, but to buy at cheap prices, to all kinds of other objects that became products of slavery over 4 centuries, and really, for many people, unknowingly. They just became part of habits, as the word in the title indicates. Even sugar bowls. Entire chapter on sugar bowls. It's a wonderful chapter where Jim talks about how callous oppression, his words, could bring forth Western fashion and luxury. He did a lot of the research right here. It's about the things that slavery produced, and then it's ultimately about the larger story of slavery as a kind of global, worldwide commerce. Jim, it is always wonderful to bring you back to Yale. Stay as long as you want. Ladies and gentlemen, Jim Walvin.
David, thank you very much indeed. I'm going to book him for my obituary. He's the obvious man. I've got a number of thanks, first of all. Thanks to all of you for coming on such a lousy day. There are lots of other easier, comfortable things you could be doing rather than sitting here listening to me, so thank you. But of course I do owe institutional thanks to this great centre who had me as fellowship and who sowed the ideas really for 3 books actually, along with the Gilder Lehrman Center. Here, the Gilder Lehrman and the Beinecke, between them, they spawned 3 books that I actually hadn't intended writing. I had no idea I would write these books, but they emerged from the kind of luxury of working in this quite extraordinary place and the university as a whole. So thank you to all of them. And there are particular colleagues in the audience that I should thank individually, but I won't. But they know who they are, and I thank them anonymously here. Now, the lecture title is a kind of variant of the book itself, of the title of the book. And everything I want to say, really, is about slavery. It all hinges on, returns to, and circles the question of African slavery in the Americas. And what it tries to do, really, is to make a point that seems, to many people in this audience and outside, an obvious point, and that is that slavery is a central issue in the shaping of the modern Americas. I mean, it's such an obvious point, but it wasn't so obvious not so long ago. And it's central to the shaping of all kinds of cultural attributes and formats in ways that we don't recognize. You know, the kind of so many things that we enjoy and admire and love have drifted drifted loose from their slave origins. And it's that I want to return to time and again, how slavery shaped cultural values, norms, and phenomena that in ways that we, as I say, we don't recognize them. Slavery is as American as apple pie, isn't it? But it's also very European. And here's a really interesting divergence, because it is Europeans who create the slavery that emerges in the Americas. It's the Europeans that found the slave systems that evolved with their toeholds on West Africa and with their slave colonies scattered across the eastern littoral, really, of the Americas, from Brazil through the Caribbean into North America. This is a European phenomenon. But the trouble is that although Europeans found it and shape it and give it direction, it's something that Europeans have managed to avoid entangling themselves with and continue to do so. To most Europeans, and with the exception of specialists in the field, most Europeans, if you were to ask them, would think of slavery as something that's over there. Looking at it from the point of view of Europe, it's over there, it's overseas, it's something to do with Africa, it's something to do with slave ships in the Atlantic, it's something to do with slave colonies in the Americas, but it's only marginally related to Europe itself. Well, clearly that isn't the case. It's fueled, the whole slave system, it's fueled by a kind of titanic enforced movement of peoples, the likes of which we'd not seen and were not to see again, really, until the 20th century. The numbers are staggering. We know this now because, again, this is a Yale published product. There is a quite extraordinary database on the slave trade. There's no argument now about the numbers. You can argue about the edges. We're arguing about the edges, adding a little bit here and there. But the numbers are pretty clear. We know that something in the region of 12 million plus Africans are loaded onto the slave ships in West Africa. And we know that in the region of 11 million plus survive landfall, scattered throughout the Americas. These are immense numbers, given, of course, the population of the Earth at the time. You're dealing with a population that is much, much, much lower than anything that we're familiar with today. This is a phenomenon of a numerical immensity, but also, of course, of immense geography, that the Europeans pluck their Africans from a huge coastal region of Africa, from Senegambia all the way down to Angola, but particularly from Luanda. We now know that more than 2 million Africans leave Luanda for Brazil. 2 million. These are staggering numbers. The geography of this is immense, from Senegambia to Angola and on round to Mozambique. It's clear that the slave trade is much, much more complex than even that rough sketch suggests. It's something that, we're familiar with. We've grown up with the idea of the phenomena being something to do with the Atlantic trade, the triangular trade, rather. That concept is kind of embedded in popular culture. And after a fashion, it's useful because it does link together the three main ingredients of Europe, Africa, and the Americas. But of course, the trade itself, the movement of Africans and the shipping involved in that is geographically much more complicated than we might think. Back and forth, east and west, north and south. It is really quite extraordinary movement of people. We also know, again, thanks to the recent work of Eltis and David Richardson, that there are two major systems inside the Atlantic. There's the South Atlantic system, the North Atlantic system, and much of those two separate systems are determined and shaped by natural factors, by currents and winds. The fastest route across the Atlantic is the one in the south, from particular points in West Africa to Brazil. That's the quickest way of getting a ship across. So that it's a system that breaks down into two separate parts. But even that doesn't give you a sense of the really interesting features that we've been discovering about the slave trade, and that I'll come to later. and that is it is plugged into a global trading system that historians of the Atlantic need now to actually start giving attention to. This is not just about the Atlantic, it's actually a global phenomenon. We need really to raise our vision a little and think of this not simply about the Atlantic. Now, the enslaved people that we're talking about produce goods, commodities that transform the face of the Americas. That's, again, pretty clear. But it also affects the wider world, and again, in ways that we don't understand. And the book I've done, Slavery in Small Things, is a way of trying to explain that by looking at small items. Can we talk about this? Can we tease something out about slavery from simply looking at individual objects, cultural artifacts, habits? And I explain how that came to mind, really, as I go along. But throughout all this, the more I thought about it, it was pretty clear that, as I say, Europeans and Americans throughout the Americas, that is, think of slavery really quite differently. In this hemisphere, slavery is local. It becomes local. It's something that people experience on the ground, face to face, in Brazil, in Jamaica, Barbados, in Virginia, wherever. That's not true in Europe. Slavery is 5,000, 3,000 miles away. And that's allowed a kind of smokescreen to develop between the Europeans and their slaving past. Europeans like to think of this as something that is more American than European. It is, in a way, actually, it's very influenced by a very famous Australian historian who was writing about the tyranny of distance, the thing that shaped Australian identity, the tyranny of distance from the rest of the Western world. Well, actually, it's just a tyranny of distance that serves to distance Europeans from what their involvement in slavery had created in the Americas and elsewhere. When you think of slavery, you think of something that is brutal, that is savage, that is harsh in every extreme. But what you don't do is associate it with beauty, with items of sensibility. And yet one of the curious things, one of the great paradoxes of slavery is that the slave system actually does produce artifacts that are remembered now for their beauty. But what people don't do is to subject those artifacts to a kind of a rounded investigation. They don't walk round an object and criticize it and think, how did it emerge? What's its kind of historical origin? Who, for instance, and this is the starting point, who would visit Harwood House and imagine that this quite magnificent place has anything to do with slavery? And I've used this time and again, partly because it's close by. It's within 20 minutes' drive of where I live. It's halfway between Leeds and Harrogate in Yorkshire. It's one of England's great stately homes. They're related to the royal family, the cousins to the Queen. They were, of course, slave owners. In 1833, when the British abolished their slavery and compensate the slave owners to the tune of £20 million, the largest single capital sum the British government had ever set aside, brokered by the Rothschilds, the largest capital sum, apart from warfare, that the British government had actually produced up to that point. When that was done, the Harwoods were in receipt of over £23,000 for the almost, I think, 1,300 enslaved people that they owned primarily in Barbados and in Jamaica. And if you want to see, those of you who go to Barbados on holiday, just open the telephone directory and look up the name Harwood and look up the name Lascelles, which is the family name. And there are hundreds of them. That's a real giveaway. Who'd think that opening a telephone directory and it takes you straight to the world of slavery, but it does. Well, this is just one spectacular example. And there are many, many more coming to light, really, month by month in the UK as people follow this particular argument up. But think, too, of the other grand homes that we visit in this country that stand out, really, because of their slaving past. And Monticello would be, I suppose, the most fabulous and best-known example. And it's interesting to note, both in the case of Monticello and of Mount Vernon, of just how those two institutions have changed in the last 20 years, say, in confronting their slave past. If you go to Monticello today, which is a wonderful spot and a fantastic building, with extraordinary contents of this remarkable man, one of the first things you're confronted with by the tour guides is the issue of slavery. Now, when I first went there as a tourist in the 1980s, I asked the question of the, I can't remember what they called them in those days. They didn't call them guides. They were hostesses, I think they were called. And they would talk as if Tom Jefferson had just gone out for the afternoon and left you free to wander around. It was a really extraordinary way they interpreted the place. But if you asked questions about slavery, they looked at you as if you'd asked something extraordinarily rude. Whereas now, because it's right up front, they deal with slavery straight away. It's true at Mount Vernon. I mean, people need to ask that question, and the questions are answered before you even raise them. But of course, there are many other fabulous architectural survivals of slavery in this country where slavery is a noise off stage, and a very unpleasant noise that's not confronted. They don't want to talk about. Look, if you take a tour bus around Natchez, look at those extraordinary houses on the bluffs, the main streets around Natchez. Many of them have the tour guides, and the tour guides showing you around don't mention slavery. Simply don't mention the fact that the wealth that went to build those houses was African-American labor in the cotton fields close by. They simply don't mention it. And if you really don't believe this, I invite you to Google the James River plantations, the road that runs between Williamsburg and Richmond, Highway 5, where there's a string of plantations. Look at their websites for those plantations. And they are very beautiful houses, but of course what they talk about are the architectural attainments, the beautiful artifacts of furniture inside, but some of them simply don't mention the fact that what made all that prosperity possible were the Africans cultivating tobacco in the fields around it. Google them, you can find out. There are many ways in which slavery lurks behind beautiful objects. Who again would think of slavery having anything to do with this? This is a quite magnificent sugar bowl. It's Sèvres, 1760. It's in the V&A collection. And go to any major museum gallery on both sides of the Atlantic, and you'll find porcelain collections of this kind. This, as I say, is from the V&A, but you could go to the Museum of Fine Art in Boston for the same kind of introduction to beautiful porcelain. Sugar bowls. But where's the sugar coming from that fills that bowl in 1760? Well, we know it's coming from the French Caribbean, and it's coming particularly from Saint-Domingue, from Haiti. And up to the point in 1791, when the great slave upheaval takes place, this seismic explosion of slave anger that destroys the Saint-Domingue colonial society and sends tremors throughout the slave-holding world of the Americas, sends thousands of Haitians fleeing to North America, to New Orleans, but particularly to Charleston. If you go to the main Catholic church in downtown Charleston, there you'll see large numbers of French planters who'd fled with their slaves from the revolution in Haiti. The sugar that goes into this sugar bowl is made by Africans, and it's cultivated in Saint-Domingue under conditions of extraordinary brutality. We know that something like 800,000 Africans were shifted into Saint-Domingue in the years before 1791. 800,000 into that one tiny island. Now, clearly, they're not just producing sugar. They're producing other commodities as well, but sugar is the main thing. But who would think of it looking at that beautiful sugar bowl? Who would think of sugar having anything to do with this portrait? I don't know if anyone recognizes him, but it's the Sun King. It's Louis XIV. This is a portrait painted in 1701 by Rigaud. It hangs in the Getty now. Louis, when this was painted, was 63 years old. Now, if you look at it, he looks pretty tall. He's actually 5'4". There's nothing wrong in being 5'4", by the way. He's got a wonderful head of curly hair, except he's as bald as a badger. It's his wig that you're looking at there. And the other fact about him that is hidden in this picture is that he hasn't got a tooth in his royal head. He'd lost all his teeth by the age of 40. And why had he lost all his teeth? Well, he loved his sugar. He loved his sugar, cultivated by the Africans in Saint-Domingue and Martinique and Guadeloupe. And you'll notice, of course, that he's not smiling, for very good reasons. Now, there is a wonderful book about this by a man called Colin Jones called The Smile Revolution. It's published a couple of years ago. A very, very prominent historian of the French Revolution, Colin Jones. It's a wonderful book about the changing nature of smile in 18th century portraiture. It sounds It sounds one of these extraordinary kind of particular academic topics, but it actually opens up a wide world because it takes you into the world of slavery and sugar. Aristocrats in the French court do not like smiling because they have lousy teeth, just as Elizabeth I had. And again, she used to clean her teeth with sugar. Not surprisingly, she had fewer of them left by the time she was an old woman. There is an argument for saying that the sensibility of the time was that smiling was actually not something that you did. Smiling itself was thought to be vulgar in a portrait. But in fact, the real reason, the very good reason why he didn't smile was that he had no teeth. But who would think of that having anything to do with slavery when looking at this portrait? Again, this is a picture I've got at home, actually. It hangs in our dining room. Who'd think of slavery having anything to do with this? It's an 18th century smoking club. Gentlemen enjoying themselves, enjoying the coffee, and that's obviously a naval veteran with his pot leg there. But all smoking away. Now, who would imagine that that's got anything to do with slavery? Well, of course, it does. This is the weed that was a Native American habit, which the Europeans transformed into a global commodity and a global epidemic, courtesy of African slaves, first of all in Brazil, then in Barbados, but then more particularly in the Chesapeake. The Chesapeake becomes the great driving engine behind the rise of tobacco, exporting it through Glasgow, and I'll return to Glasgow in just a second. Who would think that this has got anything to do with slavery? But it does. Even more remote, you might think, from slavery is this. This takes me home. This is the coat of arms of the city of Manchester. Coat of arms that was ordered and organised in 1842 when Manchester had established its fame as the shock city of the Industrial Revolution, the place that huge numbers of people went to just see what was happening. These very large buildings, the largest buildings that the West had ever seen, all gas-lit. The city was lit up at night in a way that cities weren't lit up at night previously. You couldn't see it because it was shrouded in filthy smoke belching from the chimneys. It's cotton. It's the world of cotton. It's the shock city of the Industrial Revolution. But if you look at this coat of arms carefully, there are some very curious features about it. At the top, you see the globe and bees around it. Actually, I had a bee on my school cap because that was our motto, the bee. And it denotes industry, of course, busy bees. That's what we were, busy bees. But the most curious thing about it is the sailing ship in the middle. The sailing ship that, why on earth would a landlocked city, Manchester is 30-odd miles from the nearest coast, why would it have a sailing ship? Well, the answer seems pretty obvious now, isn't it? It's cotton, and it's cotton that's coming to Manchester out of Mobile and New Orleans. And from there, of course, it had been drawn from the cotton plantations around the Mississippi Delta. And we could tell the same story of Lowell, Massachusetts, but this happens to be my hometown, and it's a good illustration of the way slavery actually is there, right under your nose, but we simply haven't noticed it. And this gives me a chance, really. It picks up on something David said right at the beginning, to be slightly autobiographical, because on the question of cotton, this is actually exactly where I was born and raised. If I can just manage this, this is where I work. My first job was here. This is the Gladstone Mill. The church I belong to, you can see the spire running alongside behind the chimney there. And our house is there. Really delightful it was. And all those chimneys are cotton chimneys. They're all cotton mills. It didn't strike me as being unusual because it was all I knew at the time. Three of my grandparents were cotton workers. The other one was a miner, and the mines were dotted around the Lancashire coalfield to produce the fuel for the cotton. But it never occurred to me that this had anything to do with slavery. I was just very interested in cotton and working class life, etc., etc. And this cotton mill, now this actually is a later cotton mill. This was built in 1906, the Regent. That mill was 200 yards from our front door. So this is a world that's actually dominated by cotton, absolutely dominated by it. It's everywhere. It dominates the landscape, as you could see from that previous picture. It dominates the landscape, and of course, it damages the lungs of tens of thousands of people, like the coal mines. I mean, cotton workers die in there, the thousands really, because of the contamination from the cotton dust that they work in throughout a working life. This is the world then of behind these pictures and behind the coat of arms. It's the world of cotton, and it's the axis between Manchester and Liverpool. That cotton comes into Liverpool and is shipped on to Lancashire, to Manchester and the other surrounding textile towns. Now, if you think of Liverpool, Liverpool is well known as a kind of slave trade, a dominant slave trade port in the 18th century. We think that perhaps 1 in 5 Africans travel across the Atlantic in the late 18th century in ships from Liverpool. You can't really look at the modern face of Liverpool without thinking of the slave past. And of course it now has a wonderful museum which until 1992 simply didn't exist. There was no major reference, acknowledgement of slavery and the slave trade in the making of Liverpool's history. In the Maritime Museum, up until 1992, the only reference to the slave trade was a little map in a corner showing the triangular trade with a bag of sugar underneath it, and that was it. But since then, of course, things have moved on dramatically, and they have a very fine whole museum devoted to this subject. The city's coming to terms, but changing with slavery and with its attitude, with its relationship to the slave trade. But of course, what people tend to forget, of course, is that its dealings with cotton is also slave-based. Up until 1860, the great bulk of its business is imported cotton from the US South, and that only changes with the Civil War and the ending of slavery. That slavery is at the heart of the story of Liverpool and of Manchester in ways, again, that obvious now, but less obvious to lots of folks. Now, all of this actually came into focus when, in a house move, in the last house move we did, I went through all my history notes. I kept all my history notes and my essays from when I was an undergraduate and a graduate, and pretty bad they are too. I feel quite ashamed of that. I should have got rid of them, but actually they're interesting documents now. But the interesting thing is that in all the history I studied between 1960 and 1966, as an undergraduate and as a graduate student, there's not one word of slavery. Not one word. And I was taught well. I had very good education, good places I went to, good teachers. No mention of slavery at all. Nothing at all until I branched out into a different area when I'd already become a kind of journeyman historian. Now, it's curious because if you think today that we're awash with scholarship on slavery. I think Tom Thurston, sitting in the audience, does this annual bibliography of thousands of pieces written every year on the slave trade. That wasn't the case until actually very, very recently. Well, when I finally turned to slavery for reasons that I needn't detain us, but when I did, and came here, I was thinking about slavery in a very broad sense. I was in search of one particular thing. I was in search of the Zong, the slave ship that David mentioned. And I went in search of Turner's great painting, The Slave Ship. Got a staggeringly, kind of overpowering picture, really, depressing too. In some extraordinarily interesting things written about it. It hangs in the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. And I took 2 days out from this very building to go up to Boston to look at it. And I was taken aback, but it's a small painting. I'd expected something big, something like this, because the subject is big. It demands size, doesn't it? In fact, it's quite small. It's, I don't know, this wide, this deep, it's really 3-4 feet. Very, very, and I was taken aback by that. And of course, being the Museum of Fine Art and being, like so many museums, they're almost ruined by their own success. It's very hard, actually, to stand in front of it without being buffeted all the time. So I kept coming back to it. It's like being in a football match sometimes, bash, crash, someone walks across you. Now, how can you complain because you're just one of them anyway? But anyway, I kept coming back to it. But in the meantime, I wandered round the Museum of Fine Art. And what struck me was not just this extraordinary painting, but the remarkable riches. Those of you who know the place will just nod your head. This is a quite remarkable place. And the riches were not just graphic painting. What caught my eye was the furniture. There's a huge amount of mahogany furniture. Here's one piece, North American, Rhode Island. There's another piece, card table. And I was struck by why would Americans like mahogany furniture? Mahogany is not native to North America. It's imported from the Caribbean and Central America. This is a country that is groaning in timber. Why would you go to the expense of importing an extraordinary piece of wood, great distance from the Caribbean and Central America, to produce furniture? And it left a kind of question in my mind. At the same time, I was working in colonial Williamsburg on another project. And exploring the buildings at colonial Williamsburg and the exhibits, again, I was struck by a remarkable number of mahogany furnishings. There's one. There's another. And blow me down, back to Harwood House, there's another. Now, this is a spectacular piece. This is the state dining room at Harwood House. This is all Chippendale. Every piece of wood around that room is Chippendale, made for the Lassells family, for the Harwoods. It's a quite extraordinary piece of work. But it raises the question of why does fashionable society in the late 18th century become so interested in mahogany? There is a very fine book on this written by a woman called Jennifer Anderson about mahogany. And what happens is that in 1721, the British government have a change of fiscal policy and they remove duties on imported timber to encourage shipbuilding, because local timbers and Scandinavian timbers are running short. They need it for the Royal Navy and for maritime shipping. But craftsmen realized in mahogany they have a beautiful hardwood that they could do things with that you couldn't do with others. And you could leave it with a patina, with a polish. And if you look at so many 18th century portraits, they're very often reflected in the table, in the furnishing that is made from mahogany. This at Williamsburg and this at Harwood is an illustration of this quite extraordinary phenomenon, this interest in mahogany. What really struck me about the mahogany at Williamsburg was that I thought I'd better track it elsewhere. Where else was it coming from? So I turned to the Virginia Gazette. And in the Virginia Gazette, there are references after references to mahogany imported into Virginia. When people die and leave their mahogany furniture, a sale of a house with its contents, mahogany furniture, wills, deeds, shipping records with mahogany shipped into Norfolk, Virginia, into the Chesapeake from the Caribbean to satisfy this cult of furniture made from mahogany. This is just the most spectacular example of it all. And it's all to do with the way the law changes in 1721 and the fashion that evolves. And in the British case, it devolves around the city of Lancaster. Lancaster becomes the centre of mahogany furnishing. The company called the Gillows, that the Gillows actually survive as a company into the 20th century. They have a shop on Oxford Street, or had a shop on Oxford Street. All of this grounded in slavery. The problem is, looking at that that mahogany table in the Harwood House, who'd ever think it's got anything to do with this? Now, the problem with the slaves working in mahogany in the forests is that they are out of sight, out of mind. We don't really see them very often. We find very few references to them. There are not very good and not many illustrations of them at work, unlike, say, sugar plantations or cotton plantations. But this is a very poor sketch of, this is from the 1820s. It gives you some idea of the kind of extraordinary labour that's required to move logs of really remarkable size. These are huge, huge pieces of wood. There's another illustration of, this is slightly later, of Africans moving wood onto trestles that they can ship down to the water's edge. The slaves have to build pathways from where they're logging to the riverside, then take the waters, rather like modern, take the logs down the waters to the nearest ships waiting for it. Again, just one more example to give you illustration of the size. These are immense pieces of wood, and it's all cut and moved by African labour in the rainforests. But who thinks of that when they're looking at the state dining room at Harwood House? There are any number of objects that you look at carefully and you suddenly see slavery. Who'd think that slavery's got anything to do with this? These are cowrie shells, obviously cowrie shells. A collection of them there. Today, of course, they're very, very fashionable, particularly amongst African American women. Necklaces, bracelets in the hair, on the clothing. who thinks it's got anything to do with slavery? There is an illustration, just an obvious illustration of a woman wearing a cowrie necklace. But look at this. This is a Ghanaian coin, and it has a cowrie shell on it. Now, the strange thing about this is that the cowrie shell in this particular picture represents the way a cowrie shell was being used in West Africa. It started in West Africa as a means of exchange for African slaves. What you're looking at here is a quite extraordinary phenomenon, and that is cowrie shells from the Maldive Islands in the middle of the Indian Ocean finding their way to West Africa, where they're used to be exchanged for African slaves. Think of this for a second. These cowries, and the two historians who dominated this field, I mean, it does, again, sound a very obscure field, but it opens up an extraordinary global richness. The historians who've worked on this calculate that something like 10 billion shells were deposited in West Africa in between 1700 and 1800. These shells had gone from the Maldives to India, to the European ports, mainly to Rotterdam and to London, where they're transshipped to West Africa and become part of the cargoes that are used to exchange for Africans. Now, if you think of this for a minute, they've travelled 16,000 miles. This is a quite extraordinary piece of economic exchange. Cowrie shells from the Indian Ocean being used in West Africa to provide European slave traders with Africans to produce tropical commodities in the Americas, which themselves are transforming the wider world. What you're looking at is not just an Atlantic economy. You're looking at an Atlantic economy that sucks into it extraordinary economic activity from the far reaches of the world in ways that we simply haven't thought about. And it was when looking at this and looking at little bits and pieces, I began to think there's a book in this, if I can just somehow or other give it a shape. And what really encouraged me to do that was reading Neil MacGregor, the then director of the British Museum. This is really one of the great figures, really, intellectual figures, I think, of our times. He is a quite extraordinary man, who did this wonderful series, History of the World in 100 Objects. And he had the great advantage, of course, of sitting on top of this at the British Museum. But he produced this wonderful exhibition and a terrific book with it, and a very fine 20-part BBC series where he took objects and talked very seductively, as only he can, around things, items, objects, commodities, to tell a story, an interesting historical story. And I thought, well, I'll give it a whirl. If he can do it, I can give it a try. And this is what has happened. But what, of course, the cowrie shells do, and other little items, is raise this critical question about the Atlantic in a wider world. It's goods from India. It's goods from the Maldives. It's commodities from the American frontiers. The native peoples of the Americas are seduced into consuming huge amounts of rum grown and cultivated in the Caribbean in return for their what? For their pelts, for their skins, and for their timbers. And the undermining, that's a little descant there, and the undermining of so many Native American communities by rum, which is grown in the Caribbean, cultivated in the Caribbean, is part of this process. Indian commodities finding their way into the maws of this quite extraordinary global business that we think of as Atlantic, but actually is much broader. And really, this is the kind of point that the broader point I want to make, and that is that this is an Atlantic that doesn't stand alone. It's linked, it's connected. It's connected to distant regions, and it's connected to distant societies. It's true that the Atlantic economy is complex in itself, but in its onward distant connections, it actually defies any easy definition, any comprehension. It's a very, very complex phenomenon. And it's a world that's very keen on exchange, it's keen on barter, it's keen on trade. But what lubricates that trade in the world of the Atlantic is the exchange for Africans. It's African sweat that lubricates this whole phenomenon. And let me just illustrate this once again by one simple commodity. I happen to use another beautiful object. This is a punch bowl. This is actually from the Museum of Fine Art in Boston again. It's Sèvres. It's, I forget the date now, it's 1770s, I think. 1771, something like that. A beautiful item, but what it does actually is illustrate the use of rum. And rum becomes a quite extraordinary commodity both sides of the Atlantic. We know, for instance, that rum is used to pacify the African slaves throughout the Americas. They produce the rum and they have it in their rations. It makes them happy. It keeps them hard at work. The Royal Navy ticks over on rum. Rum is introduced from 1731 and it continues till 1970, a regular daily tot of rum to men serving in the Royal Navy. It was actually served in the army in the United States until, I think, 1832. Captain Cook, in his epic voyages in the 1760s and 1770s in the Pacific, he gives his men a twice daily allowance of 1 pint of rum each, boys half a pint, 2 pints of rum each a day. That's a huge amount. The military everywhere need rum to keep ticking over. And one of the other great ironies is rum is even shipped to West Africa. Africans begin to like the taste of rum. So rum that is cultivated by Africans in Brazil and Barbados finds its way into West Africa, where it's exchanged for yet more Africans. Slavery is a monster that kind of feeds upon itself. Now, wander around many of the great museums in the Western world, and if you're coming across rum, it's likely to be that. It's likely to be a punch bowl. But who thinks that behind that lurks something else? And finally, in terms of artifact, I'd like you to think about paper. Paper is such an obvious item. It's the substance that most historians work with, in one way or another, manuscript or in print. Now, this actually is a list of enslaved people working on Hampton Plantation in Jamaica in 1771. Now, what I'd like you to brood on in this is that when Africans enter this slave system, they are documented at every point of the way. Africans, when they're sold on the coast of Africa, enter the world of written documentation. When they're transferred to a ship, they're entered into another form of documentation on the ship's documents. They're registered again in written form at landfall when they're bought by other people. And when they enter their own workplace, perhaps their final workplace in the Americas, a plantation or whatever it is, there they enter the paperwork of their masters and mistresses, where they're documented in very great detail. I mean, there is a case for saying, actually, that the Africans in this system are better documented than free labourers at much the same time. And they are better documented because they are items of trade and commodity. It's because they are things, because they are chattel. They are bought, they're sold, they're bequeathed, they're inherited. It's because they're things, as painful as that sounds, they enter the literature that we're all so familiar with. And anyone in any doubt about this need only just walk across the road to the Beinecke, where there are tons of this material, not to mention printed material. Now, in the British case, the scribes of this entire system, the scribes of it are the Scots. The Scots are everywhere on the slave plantations of the Americas, of the English-speaking Americas. They're more numerate, they're more literate, they're more assiduous. Now, I don't want to get into why this is, but just take it that they are critical elements in the documentation of slavery. The English don't like them for that very reason. They've got the edge on the English. They're more literate, they're more numerate, they're everywhere. And there's some very rude things about them said by the English. Now, the curious thing here is that Scottish historians have simply missed this in a very big way until very recently. Now there's a lot of stuff coming out. One of Scotland's great historians, Sir Thomas Devine, a very distinguished man. His first books were on the tobacco barons of Glasgow. No mention of slaves. He recognises this now and has made good and written and edited some terrific things about Scotland and slavery. And it's everywhere. But the point about this is that the world of slavery is not just the world of the enslaved. It's a system that actually is shaped by a literate world. It's the world of Western literacy in ways that we simply take it for granted because literacy is something that we're all familiar with. Let me finally conclude. The way in which we can approach slavery in different ways. A simple seashell opens up this extraordinary story of trade between the Atlantic and Asia. That portrait, there's one portrait of an unsmiling king, takes you into the world of royal rotten teeth and sugar. A quite extraordinary table in an English aristocratic home takes you into the world of mahogany and slaves working in the rainforest. And a very unremarkable coat of arms from the city of Manchester takes you into the whole world of cotton and the transforming world of cotton in the 19th century. Now, I could go on. I could list any number of things. I could list a number of items to add to this. But at the heart of all this, there is one feature that is basic, seminal, and unavoidable, and that is the story of slaves and slavery. What lies behind all these objects, and what you can see when you tease the objects apart, is the world of African slavery in the Americas. And if you look close enough, you can see them, even in the smallest of things. Thank you.
Questions? I'll let you choose the answer yourself. Do we have mics at all? We do. We do.
Stunned.
Anyone with a good loud voice wants to go? Oh, there's a mic. Somebody must go first. Yes, sir.
Oh, I'm glad it's that. You don't need that.
Yeah, we do, because we're...
Oh, great. Fantastic. All right, I hope I screwed this one up. Am I in there now?
Yeah.
Oh, that's how my voice sounds terrible. Did, in the beginning, did you mention that you worked with Michael Crichton? Jurassic Park guy, Michael Crichton. Did I hear that correctly? Or is it another Michael Crichton, another guy with a similar name?
Different spelling.
Different spelling, okay.
Otherwise, I'd be a million hours in here.
Yeah, I was just curious what he thought about all the rubber dinos. When I was a kid, we all loved the rubber dinos. They were everywhere. We were all running around chasing each other with the rubber dinos and the little men's arms you could pull off and all this stuff. And I was curious what Michael Crichton, if you knew him at the time, would have thought about all of it. But another similar name.
One's Crichton, the other's Crichton. Crichton's the one you're talking about.
Yeah. That's not necessarily my favorite guy, but. Oh, all right. The blurry image of the drawing. There was a drawing. It was like done in the 1830s, and it looked very pixelated when you showed it up on the screen. What was the source of it? Where did you find it? Like, what's the story behind that picture?
I can't remember where it came from. No. The one where it had the Africans dragging the logs, that one.
Yes. Yeah.
That one.
Yeah.
Yeah? I couldn't tell you where it came from off the top of my head. I know, but it's,
I always find drawings like that very powerful and frightening.
Hang on, Gillian, hang on, please, thanks.
Welcome back, Jim, and thank you for the talk. But I wanted to ask you if you could say something about the kinds of agency that the kinds of objects that you've shown us tonight have, in terms of debates about enslavement, for and against, whether you think these small objects, whether they have that kind of polemical or other kinds of power, or whether you just think that, you see them as sort of repositories of the product of state slavery, or sort of made with the, with the proceeds of slavery, or they have, lives of their own, as well.
I pondered long and hard about this because people said, well, sugar bowls are sugar bowls. Sorry. I pondered long and hard about this, that you say, well, sugar bowls are sugar bowl, there's an end to it. But it's the making of objects, isn't it? It's the creation of them. It's the ways in which a material artifact becomes so embedded in Western life that you don't understand its origins. And well, the trouble is, I'm not you know better than I am. I'm not trained as an art historian or as a historian who works with the material objects. And I'm very conscious of my own limitations on that. And it was working here that brought that awareness home to me. But on the other hand, I mean, I don't see why you shouldn't take evidence that's different from the normal evidence that you would work with as a historian and subject it to similar questions. You know, what's the origin of this piece of information? In this case, a cowrie shell. Who brought it into being? Why was it so important? What's its relationship to the wider world of slavery? All of those questions, I think. I can see that the difficulty is actually, in writing a book about this, the difficulty is actually shaping it in a fashion that has a kind of coherence and that just doesn't become a string of little vignettes. On the one hand, we have a cowrie shell, on the other, we have a sugar bowl. You know, the key to it is getting the narrative of the book right, I think.
And just as a follow-up, I mean, are there small things that you're considering in your book? Have you also looked at the kinds of objects that are produced in the service of the abolitionists' campaign, you know, kind of Wedgwood,
yes.
you know, bowls and jewellery, and you know,
yes.
there are many kinds of objects.
Yes.
So I wondered if that's part of your
Yes, I mean the thing. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, what are the
investigation.
two great images that the abolitionists campaigning against the slave trade particularly use? First of all, it's sugar, the anti-Saccharites, the campaign against sugar, the great cartoons and caricatures of people who give up sugar in order to bring down the slave trade. That's dealt with. But the one thing two items that I'm very interested in is the slave ship, the Brooks, the famous cross-section of the slave ship, the 1788, drawn up initially by the Quakers in Plymouth. That becomes a quite extraordinary kind of motif that has been used right up to the present day. In fact, used by a recent Dutch historian talking about crowding in aeroplanes. You know, I mean, this is something that actually has an extraordinary potency that's gone way beyond the campaign against slave trade, that cross-section of the Brooks. And the other one that I think is very interesting, and that I was going to talk about here, but I thought I'd leave it because it's just one of the others, is the whole question about chains. If you want an image of slavery, you can put someone in chains. It captures it. People always think chains. Now, it's something that a lot of people don't like for very obvious reasons. In 2007, chains were everywhere. Whenever an idea came up for commemorating abolition, people put forward a link of chains, especially if it's been rent asunder. A black hand with chains that are asunder, somehow or other summed the whole thing up. Now, that's a very interesting set of images, actually, the question of metalware, chains, and Africans. I mean, you can't work in a cotton plantation or a sugar field in chains. You can't. These are something that emerged from the slave ships, but have somehow or other become embedded in the popular mind as typical and characteristic of what slavery is. And for that reason, of course, African Americans don't like it. But there's another way around this. There isn't a slave ship that leaves the West African coast that it doesn't have its Africans shackled in somewhere or other. Chains equals a recognition that without the chains on the ships, the slaves would have overthrown the whole system. Chains are a symptom as much of African resistance as of African defeat. So,
I was wondering if all this all...
Sorry, one more, and then I'll get to you. Okay.
You kind of touched on this already, but it strikes me that the abolitionists were well aware of the connection between many of the products that were produced by slavery, sugar and tea and that, and used, I think of all the poetry that was used where these things were summed up and stood in for the enslaved Africans that had produced them. So there was a point where these kind of connections were pretty widely known and used for their purposes.
yes.
So how does that disappear? I mean, there's this moment where people were aware of these connections. It's not as if we've suddenly discovered them. If anything,
No.
we've unearthed them.
Well, I think what you touched on there, Tom, is an issue that lies right at the heart of the historiography of this story, and that is that having been the pioneers of abolition, effectively the pioneers, the British look back on their history as abolitionists rather than slaveholders and slave traders, and that abolition becomes a kind of smokescreen that masks what had gone before as to what came after. And it came up as a criticism throughout 2007 that why are we going on about this? We were the first people to abolish the slave trade. You know, why do you want to know more about slavery and slave trade? We were the abolitionists. And I think it's part of this way in which the British, in this case the British, come to define themselves as an abolitionist people. And of course, throughout the 19th century, the Royal Navy is trying to stop the slave trade. The British Empire is trying to stop slavery whilst encouraging its own form of colonialism. You know, it enters the DNA of the British to be abolitionist. And that becomes what we were. We were an abolitionist nation. And before you know it, by the century after abolition, say 1907, our role as slave traders has just kind of vanished in a puff of self-righteous smoke.
It was a really interesting talk. On almost all the artifacts that you've shown were manufactured by non-slaves with the resources provided by slavery. Do you get into it all artifacts or materials that were actually made by the slaves themselves with their own, with providing their own natural resources?
Interesting question. Again, well, what about rum? You see, rum, sugar and rum are made by the slaves. Tobacco's cultivated, packed by African Americans, isn't it? I mean, you know what I mean? That it's not their own economy, but they are laborers that make this whole thing possible. It's the Africans in the slave fields of the Caribbean and Brazil that produce the sugar cane, that hack it, that then take it to the factory and crush it and make it into molasses and sugar and rum.
But I imagine not too many slaves were given much rum.
Well, they were actually.
No.
It's interesting because if you look at plantation records, they do give them rum because, well, to start with, they steal it if you don't give it to them. They'll find some way of acquiring it, and planters know that they need to keep their slaves as happy as they possibly can. They give them rations. Every slave ledger I've ever looked at, they are allocated some kind of produce, especially on high days and holidays.
Definitely a really interesting talk. Just right here. Hi. In essence, I wanted to ask you to revisit an earlier answer. Was the argument there that the focus on the normative question of chattel slavery masked in Britain and then later in America the concern with the material elements that sort of were throughout the society that were directly from slave activity? I mean, growing up, you're always sort of taught, especially in public schools here, this idea of slavery was really, really bad, but then good-natured white folk fixed it. And it's always a focus on the good nature, the moral question of slavery, never the economic implications or even the global economic implications. So I'm kind of wondering if the focus on seeing one's people as abolitionists and therefore moral was the reasoning behind forgetting all of this.
Well, again, you touched on something that is right at the heart of the whole debate about A, the rationale for slavery, and B, why people turn against it. Think of the institution itself. Let's think of the slave trade for a second. 12 million people, every maritime nation in Western Europe, and then in the Americas, including Brazil, including North America. People rushing to get into this. This is a very profitable business. They're not doing it for any other reason except that it's a commercial proposition. And everyone involved in it knows that there's money to be made in it, whether it's a trader, whether it's a planter, whether it's an in-between man, whether it's a gunsmith in Liverpool providing materials for the slave ships, the metal workers providing metals for the chains on the slave ships. This is a massive economic business. And it would be very hard to turn around and say, that the basis for this is anything other than economic. I mean, there's vast money to be made from it. But that raises the question, well, then why do certain people turn against it? Do they turn against it because it's uneconomic? Or do they turn against it in a fit of moral outrage? Well, it's a bit very hard to convince students today, for instance, in my experience, that the campaign against the slave trade is any other than an economic one. That there is something in the kind of atmosphere around. They simply don't believe that people turn against something on moral or religious grounds. And that's interesting in this country as well, because where the dollar reigns, students don't believe that this kind of transformation in attitude can be brought about simply by a change of moral sensibility or religious sensibility. My own sense of this is that you're looking at a very complex historical formula where the economics change, but so too does opinion. Opinion changes. But if the slave trade is wrong in 1807, why was it not wrong in 1707 or 1607? Something has changed. And that's what historians have been sort of wrestling with for the last 40 years.
Jim, thank you so much for what, of course, is in this building, such an important conversation. And I'm thinking about these extraordinary objects that you've brought to our attention in terms of the potency that they have to bring to light whole worlds of economic dependency on slavery in these cultures, and the ways in which life is so is so imbricated into the whole process of a slave society. But what about processes of knowledge also?
The processes of
knowledge making, right. Because behind each of these objects, and of course the natural productions that are the output of slavery, are ways of making and knowing that are, of course, owned by the peoples who are enslaved and are then, in a sense, captured into a system. And how do those processes of knowledge then, in a sense, color European culture and American culture and global culture in very important ways? Because those processes, which are very different and very varied depending on which peoples one is examining, are brought into the mainstream of European culture, of American culture, and change society in these other regions of the world in extraordinarily important ways. So it's not just the thing, but what lies behind it.
Right.
Of course, that's so important. And I wondered how you had considered that aspect of the things and the making of things.
Well, I think what struck me when you were speaking there was an issue that, again, I wanted to raise and bounced away from it, and that is that one of the elements that undermines all this is the whole question about literacy. What undermines this is the emergence of a popular literacy that we again take for granted, but which serves to bring really serious doubt about slavery and the slave trade. That what people learn about slavery and the slave trade is so terrible that it actually repels them, and that it repels them from objects and cultural habits that they actually rather like. Now, you could say, well, people don't behave like that, but actually there are a lot of evidence to suggest that they do. That was certainly true in the case of South African apartheid. People felt repelled by it and chose not to buy South African goods. Boycotts work, sometimes work, not always. This is what happens with slavery. And it works because the Western world becomes fantastically literate. I mean, North America becomes a hugely literate society where the world of print, it defines so many things. And it's true in Britain at the same time. And the people campaigning against slavery and slave trade use this new world of mass literacy and popular print to tremendous effect to undermine the very benefits, really, that slavery brought to them. That people acquire a criticism of slavery because they are literate.
Jim, a question, and you'll correct me here because you know this better than I do. But when Thomas Clarkson, the great Clarkson, traveled around the itinerant career that he, part of his abolitionism became the objects he collected.
Yes.
Wasn't it? I mean, didn't he, as much as anybody, make slavery into something people could see? Chains, bowls, I mean, all kinds of things, right, that he collected.
Yes.
As he was, for decades. I mean, it just occurred to me as you were talking. Clarkson's great effort had so much to do ultimately, not just with arguments, but with the things he collected and showed, right? Isn't that what he did?
I mean, for those not familiar with this, and Thomas Clarkson is the great unsung hero of British abolition, wanders the country 30,000 miles in a few years on horseback, lecturing against it. What he carries with him is a chest, which is in the Wisbech Museum in England to this day. It's a chest with little drawers in it, and in each drawer he has an object, an item, a commodity from Africa: cotton, seeds, leather, wood, powders. These are things that you could trade with in Africa without trading in humanity. He's offering a kind of alternative form of economic activity between Europeans and Africans. This is what the world could be like if you end slavery and trade with Africa as a normal society, as a normal collection of societies. And it does have tremendous effect, actually. Sure.
In light of that, and in light of where we're sitting and these images that you've shown, I'm just thinking about public history and museums and collections, and just what this says about that. I was thinking as you were talking about the book, The Social Life of Things by, I can never pronounce the name right, Arun Appadurai. Thank you. And the idea that things move in and out of commodity status, and that another stage in the life of some things is singularization. And certainly that's what's happened with some of these things, these beautiful objects, when they get placed in museums. And then something different happens with their meaning. It's a different kind of collection than the collection that Clarkson had. They have different meanings associated with them, and more about the aesthetics and less about the labor and everything else that goes with that. So I don't know what my question is, but it's just a thought I was having.
But what happens is that people approach these materials in a totally different light, don't they? People enter Harwood House now and ask questions of the beautiful things they're looking at that were never asked 25 years ago. And they do so because the cultural world that they're coming from has created new kinds of questions. The same objects, different questions and different answers. But what has made all that possible, of course, is this quite extraordinary explosion of knowledge and interest in slavery of the last 40 years. Going back to what I said at the beginning of my undergraduate and graduate life, with not a word about slavery in the whole 6 years. Is it conceivable now that someone at a half-decent university would not be majoring in history and early graduate school history, would not be offered courses on slavery in some kind or other? Now, it's pretty unlikely, isn't it?
Hope so.
Oh, yeah.
We can take one more. Over here, this side.
Thank you. One of the things that you were doing, maybe you didn't recognize it, but you were doing what, and if Ned Cook's here, he could probably stage me on this one, is you were, I thought so, without his mustache, is you were doing this artifact-centered and then artifact-driven approach to some of your objects, which is something that's sort of a mainstay in material culture study. But what's also interesting is they said how slavery, is, as you say, the lubricant behind the commodification, the production of these various items in material culture. And a lot of us, of course, are also interested, I think the woman's comment when she talked about knowledge, we're also interested sort of what actually precedes that. I combine cultural and environmental history, so I'm often interested in the African-American expertise that ultimately provides the raw materials, be it the timber I study the fisheries, so I'm often interested in particular knowledge that produces those commodities and how do we get to that. I'm doing work in cultural landscapes and looking at how African American cultural landscapes, in a similar way, you helped me a lot with this tonight, provides a way for us to get to that, get to the environmental experience and environmental perspectives that some historians are now working on. So your work helped me in that regard, but I think in a way you're sort of, on the fringes of a methodology that's pretty well entrenched. But the woman's comment, I don't know the woman sitting there. Amy was sort of, I think maybe she was alluding to that, trying to look at some of, actually, I think of my old physics teacher, the first principles, even behind those artifact productions, the human knowledge and dexterity and skill and those other factors that ultimately get us to that stuff.
Yeah. Just one final point, and that is that made me, your point actually makes me think of it, and that is that one thing that historians of slavery are really thinking about, and this has been led by Barry Higman, the great Australian historian, is the impact of all this on the story of the environment of the Americas. That the coming of these commodities transforms the environment in ways that we really haven't thought of. The natural environment of Barbados within 50 years looks completely different. That we take sugar plantations as a natural physical environment. In fact, they're nothing like natural. They've destroyed a natural habitat and introduced something else in the same way that they'd introduced alien peoples, Europeans and Africans. The native peoples disappear. The native habitat disappears. And why does mahogany become so expensive? It's because the slash and burn system has destroyed woodland clean through great swathes of the rainforests of the Caribbean and the Caribbean coast of Central America. There are very interesting environmental issues at stake here that are only first being discussed, but I think Barry Higman's work on this, on the Caribbean, is terrific. Sorry, that doesn't really answer the question, but it opens up another area. Sorry, Amy.
One, it's really a comment. On next Tuesday evening, we open an exhibition. Thank you, Jim. Next Tuesday evening, we open an exhibition here that will focus on the three most powerful monarchical women in Britain in the 18th century, Caroline, Augusta, and Charlotte. And for those of you interested in the topics that have been really broached so eloquently by Jim tonight and the conversation that's ensued, you'll find chapters in this exhibition, I think, that will be quite stimulating, that I hope you'll be able to use in your classes and in the discourse that defines our community in very stimulating and important ways, from the anti-Saccharite satires of George and Charlotte to the silk produced on Eliza Pinckney's estate and brought to Augusta in bringing her the knowledge that she gleans from her slave population straight into the court. So I hope that it will be a great follow-up to this conversation, and we are really grateful to you, Jim, for opening up what should be an extraordinary semester in this building, thinking about these topics. So thank you for us.
Thank you, Amy. Thank you, Jim.
Thank you.